Well, thank you very much, Aleke, for doing this. Really appreciate taking the time to talk a little about your experiences with Marechera. I wonder if we might start by talking a bit about when you first encountered him as a writer and what your feelings were when you read him for the first time.
My feelings about encountering Dambutsa Marechera's work for the first time were excitement, feeling really thrilled because the work was so interestingly modernist and experimental and not at all about nativism. The moment takes us back to the late 1980s when I was embarking on my doctorate, and just in the moment now, thinking back all those years later, I can't remember precisely which came first. One was that I was writing here in the Oxford English faculty, where on whose roof we are seated. I was writing what became the English faculty's first thesis entirely on African literature. There's an entire story around that too. The challenges of finding a supervisor, for example, because my funding was tied here. But to cut a long story short, what that meant was that I was immersed in the African Writers series, the Heinemann African Writers series, and of course the House of Hunger was within that series. So I may have encountered Marechera there. I was also myself an aspirant novelist and published my first novel in 1990. So I was intrigued that somebody who had also studied from the African continent, who had studied here in the English faculty, had published a novel and had indeed been awarded the Guardian First Fiction Prize, which is of course a prominent literary prize. So that certainly drew my attention, and made certain things feel possible. Chimamanda Adichie has said of Achebe that he gave her permission, and in some ways, I don't want to overclaim, but in some ways that Marechera had been here before, in some sense, gave permission. Also, I was remarkably fortunate, and I've written about this incredible concatenation elsewhere in a piece called Ben Okri, My Neighbour and Friend. I escaped from the English faculty for various reasons that I've already in a way touched on, the sort of challenges and difficulties of writing on African fiction here in this sort of bastion of English literary history. I escaped for a year to London, where I was able to draw on the resources of the SOAS library and rented a room in a house in Finsbury Park. It was a big Finsbury Park house, Axminster Road, which was divided into two big flats, top 2 stories, and then the ground floor flat. And in the ground floor flat lived, I didn't know when I was, when I signed up to move in there, lived Ben Okri, who was at that point, he had just published Incidents at the Shrine, his book of short stories, and he was working on The Famished Road. And little by little, we got to know each other. His schedule was the complete opposite of mine. He was completely nocturnal. I was, I headed off to the library at about 8:30 in the morning, and we would meet each other in the corridor. And of course, as the history of Dambutsa Marechera in London shows, they were friends, they were drinking companions at the Africa Centre, and so Ben told me, regaled me with wonderful stories about hanging out with Marechera at the Africa Centre, and also sort of sad and stories about the frustrations that Marechera and Okri too had experienced, and ways of writing through that and writing about that. So that those are two pathways. I think probably the first came before the second, because I already knew about Marechera. I remember when I had those conversations with Ben. And then in the early 90s, I became an editor on the Journal of Southern African Studies, and it was at that point that, so this is now after Marechera's death, and after, as it were, the questions of his legacy had been raised, and at that point Flora Fight-Wilt was trying to publish about Marechera as an African modernist in the pages of JSAS, and encountered a number of resistances to that, which we can go into if we want.
And you actually had a conference here, didn't you, about Marechera, which she attended and various other people attended.
But that was 2009. Yeah, that was much later. Yeah, and at that point, I was working with my graduate student Dobrota Pucherova, who was writing a thesis about Southern African literature, and Marechera figured largely in that. She was writing about structures of desire in the Southern African novel, and we put together some internal John Fell funding to have that conference, and Flora Fight-Wilt attended, as did a number of other friends and admirers of Marechera's. James Curry was there as his editor and publisher, and it was held at a very heated moment because Derek Walcott had just stepped down from the Professor of Poetry election, so it was a very heated moment of talking about race and race representation here within the University of Oxford yet again, and within the Oxford English faculty yet again. I mean, these questions were raised when Marechera was a student. They resurfaced certainly when I was a student, and they now surfaced again. And having mentioned Flora Fight-Wilt, this was the conference at which she first spoke about her personal relationship with Dobrota Marechera.
And she's written about it quite a bit, or has interviews with it on her own archive as well, isn't she? That all links very neatly actually into thinking about, I suppose, the kind of conflicts that Marechera encountered whilst he was here, because as you said, we're sitting on top of the St Cross building, and where the English faculty library and building is kind of located. And at one point in the Black Insider, and we've spoken a bit about this in another interview I did with Tinashe Mushakvanu, he writes that, and this may or may not be him, I slept 3 nights on the roof of the English faculty library, dazed somewhat by the unusual first time without a roof, polish of the stars shining down on my sleeping bag. I was just about to start a journey of discovery in the real United Kingdom. So I guess thinking about this kind of conflicts that you've identified, or issues around kind of race and power, what do you think he meant by his journey into the real United Kingdom?
I'm sure what he meant was to step out of the strange and magical and disorienting and disorientated world that is Oxford, with all its myths of Dreaming Spires and Alice in Wonderland and Wind in the Willows and so on, and into the world of grime and grit and back-to-back houses and homelessness and Thatcherite cuts and poll tax riots. That was the real United Kingdom at that point. It is, in fact, to use the Alice metaphor, it would have been for him like stepping through a looking glass, but not into a wonderland, but out of wonderland and into this real world. Only recently have put 2 and 2 together about the faculty building referred to in that quote as being this faculty building, and this roof, which I myself only discovered many years after writing my PhD here. I mean, the roof has been wonderfully opened up by there being a coffee stand here and lots of hubbub. It was something of a deserted space in my day as a student, but it would have been closer to the stars than Marechera would have been in his New College room, or between the four walls of his college. So I can imagine, because it's a flat roof, it's worth saying to those who don't know the building, it's a flat roof, it's not a pointed roof. So, there is place to sleep, and there is place to, I would imagine, lie spread-eagled and look up at the stars. So it's so interesting to line up that quotation with the reality that we're looking at right now.
And I'm not sure, I imagine the English Faculty Library, which we can literally just see from here through a window, was here at that point. That's where it was located. So in that sense, he would literally be almost within touching distance of all those books that he kind of loved and that he aspired to read. And he had this extraordinary ability just to get through books. It's kind of amazing. Even in this book, you think about his reading list, he sort of puts together for himself of all these things which he wasn't necessarily reading as part of his course, but he was incredibly well read. So he was, within touching distance of all these things that he really loved and enjoyed reading.
I think it's Jane Bryce who shared the memory, who was a student friend of his, who shared the memory at the 2009 conference of bumping into Marechera in Radcliffe Square, walking along with a pile of tottering books, and that was her association of Dambutso, or Charles as he was referred to, I think, by some at that point, and books and reading, back to back.
There's another point in this book, The Black Insider, where he talks a bit about having, and again, I guess we're assuming it's him here, but having had his book, The House of Hunger, accepted by Heinemann, which you were just talking about, and then kind of living with a whole bunch of people who then he kind of gets to celebrate this great triumph. And I think there was a sense in which he was sort of trying to, in a way, show to Oxford, which had sort of rejected him, that he had succeeded in that sense, that he published this book. I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading just that little bit, and then maybe we can have a chat about this kind of community that he creates.
So this is a passage from the Black Insider. I tried to live like that after Oxford and found myself suddenly of great interest to the police. I was living on two very good friends from Cambridge who bore with me patiently until I finished my first book, and we got lots of cider and wine and hashish to celebrate its acceptance. The house stood in its own large wild garden. Teresa, the landlady, lived in the flat on the ground floor. She had just completed her social anthropology postgraduate course and was also in that heartbreaking mood of celebration which is not as rare as it should be sometimes. Peter and Sheila had the first floor flat. They it was also who had given me a roof in their kitchen. On the top floor lived Yoko, who was trying to learn spoken English, and John, who was reading a degree in Chinese language and literature. Anyway, they were all there at the heart of the napalm exploding inside Peter's stereo. I had invited all the other people who had in any small way put up with my tantrums and many moods while the writing was going on. In the final small hours, when the birds were chittering about in the hedge, I staggered about among the guests, inquiring if any of them had seen my father, who incidentally was dead, and the drink's fumes and hashish were igniting dynamite sticks in my brain.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think that passage is, to me, really interesting because it sort of, in some ways, seems to sort of sum up a lot of what we know about him, and maybe challenges some of those expectations that he was this kind of loner, this sort of outsider. That he was in a way sort of an insider at the same time, in the sense that he's got this whole community of people who he kind of relies on, even if, as he says, and he's very self-conscious about it, he really alienates them a lot of the time by having these moods or these tantrums or throwing things around or sometimes assaulting people, which we know he did whilst he was here. I wonder what strikes you about that kind of sense of community that he's sort of created there, and whether you think that maybe affected his response to Oxford, maybe how he kind of, whether he fitted in or whether he didn't fit in.
One quick thing is the homology that it strikes with the story, the anecdote I shared about sharing the roof, at least, with Ben Ockery and that house divided, the Finsbury Park house divided into flats. And that sense too, which I got from Ben, that Marechera was actually always at the centre of some hubbub of action. And a nocturnal creature, a nocturnal writer, but also a nocturnal party animal. In that way that I guess Ben also was at the time, but perhaps less of a party animal, because I think would need to party very hard to give Dambutsa a run for his money. So yeah, I mean it is very striking, that sense of being an insider to a certain community, that no longer being inside Oxford, or certainly not the kind of the hierarchical structures of Oxford, but nonetheless as being embedded amongst readers and thinkers and those who exchange ideas. So being on the inside of something, not simply being a kind of nomad.
Yes, that's really interesting actually, because that links quite nicely to this kind of sense of which you've written about really interestingly in the idea that Marechera is sort of peripatetic. I know he was in his life, whether it was here or back in Zimbabwe, often homeless. When he came back to Harare in 1982, he was still to a degree homeless, although I think he kind of ended up homing himself in some ways. And there's that documentary Between the Hunger and the Drought, where we actually get a vision of his room, and he had this great bookshelf of books and all these posters on the wall and the bed, and then when he gets bored he goes out and drinks in the bars. But in your essay, which is called When There Is No House to Visit, which is published in the book Lives of Houses, edited by Kate Kennedy and Hermione Lee, in 2020, in that essay you call him doubly unhoused, in the sense that he was both homeless, but also when he became a literary celebrity he was in the UK, so he wasn't in his home country. What effect do you think that kind of homeless part of his life had on his writing, this kind of peripatetic nature?
How I have always heard or read or encountered Marechera has been as a writer who is a true Afropolitan or cosmopolitan before those terms were even applied to African writing, or the term Afropolitan was invented. I mean, he absolutely blazed a trail because he unloosed himself. He detached from the rigor, the monologic rigor of national traditions and of anthemic writing and of national allegories. I mean, in that sense, he and in fact Ben Okri too, that fortuitous conjunction with Ben Okri, but his work in particular was so important to my thesis, because I was writing on nation narrations, narratives which in some sense embody or proclaim or give shape to the nation. Ngugi's A Grain of Wheat is a key example. So although Marechera was unhoused from, and sort of deliberately unhoused from giving deferring to the nation, he felt he belonged and could claim, and this is so important, especially then when there were kind of circles within circles when it came to African literatures vis-a-vis European literatures. He laid claim to influence and to traditions and to kind of formative experiences from all of his reading. I mean, Ezra Pound was as much, or T.S. Eliot was as much of a kind of literary forebear to him as Ngugi or as Charles Mungoshi. So, and that was so radical and powerful at that time, and so liberating. You kind of have no idea. I mean, in the much later, so I'm kind of going right back to that excitement about Marechera, the cosmopolitan writer, and the modernist writer, Afro-modernist. which was, there were a number of Nigerian writers who were writing against that position. It was a very difficult position to hold at that time. I mean, in several decades on in the Lives of Houses essay, I was more interested in thinking about how actually it remains difficult to dissociate from a national tradition, and it often does mean that you don't get your space in Poets' Corner, or you don't get your birthhouse museum. There's still a very close association between the idea of the writer and a national voice, and cosmopolitan writers are. Peripatetic writers. Another very good example is Christina Stead. A very different example, but a very good example. And she too, she's an Australian writer. She's a communist. She's an internationalist. She, because of her husband's work, she travels a great deal. She writes novels set in America, set in Australia, set in Malaysia, set in around and across Europe. But she doesn't have that acknowledgement or recognition that, say, Patrick White, who was much more comfortable with articulating a national voice, has in her Australian context. Likewise, Mara Chera. So I was interested in this writer whose body of work was about being inside or being outside, or moving between and across borders, but who also deliberately placed himself athwart a national tradition, and to then consider what their legacy is.
That's fascinating. So actually, that kind of sense in which he doesn't necessarily fit into a national tradition is a sort of empowering thing, actually. The kind of cosmopolitan nature that he's drawing all these different influences and not fitting into a certain way of understanding, let's say, Zimbabwean writing. That's actually quite a powerful thing for his writing and the way maybe we read his writing as well.
It is a powerful thing. I mean, I think it is also really important that, as we hear from Tinashe before, for example, that a new generation of Zimbabwean writers, young writers, are claiming Mara Chera as their own. I also think that's really important, and I also think it would be extremely important to do more about Mara Chera as a great Zimbabwean writer in Zimbabwe. I mean, absolutely. I'm not sort of, I'm talking about both and rather than either or. But I certainly do think that Mara Chera's influence is very, very liberating to writers, because there is no way of putting him in kind of one box or one category. National writer, nativist writer, or even cosmopolitan writer, because there are ways in which he is concerned throughout his work about the liberation struggle in his country and how that's going to be resolved, and what liberation means to Zimbabwe. So, he speaks in many voices.
I guess it's worth remembering as well that when he died, he'd only published 3 books: House of Hunger, Black Sunlight, Mind Blast just before that. So actually, much of what we have, the majority of what we have, actually is posthumously published. So at the time, I guess this may possibly explain why so much of his so many myths have grown up around him. It's kind of sense in which he would stand on the streets in Harare and give these speeches, or he would meet people and he'd form these communities, and he'd become very, very, as you were saying, kind of the centre of the action, or centre of attention. And yet a lot of that was predicated on him as a person, maybe, and not so much actually on the writing that certainly we know now. So that's I guess that's a question about kind of legacy as well. His legacy has really extended the way we think about him.
And I think that we can even speculate. This is speculation, but that what he does with claiming European and American voices as his own, as being in dialogue with his work, is something that Nigerian writers, arguably Ben Okori has found helpful. Ben Okori's sort of freedom with a certain magic realist inheritance, which he takes, arguably from the Latin American boom, but absolutely embeds in roughly Yoruba tradition. That is something that that freedom of kind of borrowing and transplanting and translating, and of using different voices is something that Marechera modelled for us all, but arguably also in particular for Okri in the late 70s, early 80s.
That's really interesting, because in a way that's partly what we're trying to do with this project, in the sense that we're sort of simultaneously locating him and sort of dislocating him, and allowing those kind of influences and those kind of broader places and kind of geographical locations to kind of come into the discussion about Marechera. You mentioned just a minute ago that sense of him as maybe as a Zimbabwean writer, and elsewhere you've talked a bit about how it's easy to read post-colonial writers and solely in terms of colonial power, colonisation, and that can be quite limiting if we just look at them in terms of their disruptive influences. And this is, of course, something that Marechera wrote about quite a lot and talked about extensively, particularly when he was here in Oxford, that kind of sense of kind of colonial legacy. Is that a productive way of reading him in terms of as a post-colonial writer or as a disruptive influence? Do you think we miss things by reading him just in that way?
I think we do. I think the post-colonial reading of Marechera or of Chinua Achebe as disruptive, or as reclaiming forgotten voices, or articulating the hiddenness of colonial history to date. All of that is crucial, but. And the longer I kind of persist in this career as a literary critic, the more I think this. It is also a limiting reading, because it tends to be the reading that is projected onto African writers, black writers, first and foremost, and only second are they read for their involvement in beauty, in thinking about moments of transcendence and epiphany, which I think equally was a great concern to Marechera. He'd read his modernists, he'd read Joyce. He was really, really interested in thinking about moments in time, and how to write those. But when at least in the 1990s we wanted to read him in respect of those kinds of rubrics, we were told that was to depoliticize his work. Now, if we wanted to read, the work of Ian McEwan in relation to memory and memorialization, or in relation to climate change, we wouldn't be kind of scolded in the same way. So there is something quite polarizing about post-colonial reading if it is seen as the obligatory approach to African writers as compared to, say, European writers or American writers.
That's great. That's a really interesting and kind of expansive way of thinking about his work. Elika, thank you so much. That was such an interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.